This presentation has been one of my more popular presentations over the past several years, and it's very important to me in terms of both a personal and professional nature. Professional in the sense that 20 some years ago, back when I had a regular job back in the 90s, my last regular job was as a senior purchasing agent. So the sourcing or purchasing side of the business is something that I have extensive experience with. But then also from a personal nature, because I'm really into the strategy. So if we have our typical APICS audience today, if you're familiar with our certification in production and inventory management, you know how we talk about the top down strategy that leads to the execution. So I notice as I've evolved in my career how important strategy is. So I'm going to try and stress that throughout this presentation and hope that this will be something that provides some tips, tools, and techniques that you can readily apply not only in your professional life, but maybe some of the things we'll find apply to our personal life as well. The agenda that we will accomplish by 1 p.m. is going to start out with a description of a purchasing continuum that goes from tactical buys to the strategic relationships. We'll then introduce the four major types of purchases, or we say the four types of buys that we have. We'll introduce a tool known as weighted factor analysis that will help us with supplier selection. And we'll discuss the core competencies. What do our firms compete on? What's important to our particular market niche? And the last major topic will be a description of the different types of supply chain integration, that being both vertical and horizontal. So if we look at our worksheet, the first page at the top, you have the purchasing continuum. Over on the left-hand side, you have the tactical that is described as order placement. And to the far right, you have the strategic that is based on building relationships. When we say tactical, it's really just transactional. It's one time. It's just placing an order. It's a spot buy. It's one time. Perhaps in our personal lives, we can think if we're driving somewhere on the highway and we're low on gas, we just pull into any gas station. Or maybe you run into a convenience store and grab a gallon of milk or a loaf of bread. It's not where you regularly do your weekly or monthly shopping. It's just you needed some gas or you needed some milk or a loaf of bread. You might never stop at that convenience store again. In the work environment, let's say maybe you're a small mom and pop operation, less than 50 employees. You need a new chair or a desk in an office. You just look online or you call somebody locally and you say, hey, I need a desk. It's one time. Maybe it's MRO inventory, maintenance, repair, and operating supply, a work center on a factory floor. You need some more shop rags or you need a gallon of paint to paint like a work area, or a walkway. It's just one time. You just go online, you find it. It's not long-term relationship. Strategic to the far right, that's based on a long-term commitment, multi-years or even decades. It's shared beliefs, value systems. I say a lot of times, just as people have personalities, companies have cultures, and your supply chain partners should have similar beliefs and cultures. As we move across from the left to the right, we go from a spot buy, maybe a purchase order, to what we call a blanket purchase order. You're saying I'm ordering 100 a week over the next 20 weeks. Or it could be a year-long or multi-year contract. Ultimately, To the far right, we say it's where we're true partners. We and the supplier become one firm. It's a merger or an acquisition. Now, it's very important for us to remember the Pareto analysis or the 20-80 rule. Not every purchase has to be strategic. We have to focus on what's truly important. So again, with the issue, if we're low on shop rags for the factory floor, you don't really need a strategic relationship for that. All right, it's not that critical. So think about what's important. I'd like to do a comparison here in our personal life. To the far left, where we say the tactical order placement, maybe that's going out to have a cup of coffee or a lunch with somebody. As you move across towards the right, ultimately you're in a dating relationship with somebody. Farther to the right, it's a long-term committed monogamous relationship. And to the far right, the ultimate strategic relationship with a partner is marriage. I'm smart enough at this point to not declare whether I think marriage is a merger or an acquisition. I'll let those of us decide in our own personal lives what we consider that. But we understand the different types of personal relationships. The same thing applies with suppliers. There could be a one-time spot buy, going out to coffee with somebody. To the far right, the merger or acquisition, that's a marriage. And there's a variety of items in between in terms of what's important. Below the purchasing continuum, you've got a graph that highlights along the Y or vertical axis, that is the degree of supply chain risk. Along the X axis or the horizontal axis, the percent of COGS, cost of goods sold, from low to high. I've also seen some versions of this matrix where, as opposed to percent of COGS is contribution to profit, it really means the same thing, the value of the item. So we've 4 quadrants defined by those two coordinates. In the lower left quadrant, these are non-critical items. They're not really that important. Very low supply chain risk. What does that mean? It means there's dozens or maybe 100 local vendors. They can ship it to me tomorrow, or even put it in a shipping van or a car and have somebody deliver it today. And it's not really a large portion of my cost of goods sold. It's pennies, my bill of materials. Moving across to the right, the lower right quadrant is known as the leverage items. They've got a very low supply chain risk, but they're a really high proportion of the cost of goods sold. They either show up really frequently at lots of different levels of the bill of materials or in a lot of our products. They're fairly expensive. We call these leverage items because we can leverage suppliers to bid against each other. All right, take advantage of the fact there's lots of supply. And if I can get a lower price for these, check, noting we'll still get a lot of customer service and quality. So assuming we have multiple suppliers that are going to give us the same level of quality and customer service, let them bid against each other, because every penny we save on this is an extra penny of profit. So we call these the leverage items. In the upper left quadrant is the bottleneck item. Wow, that's an item where there's limited supply out there, and holy moly, it's a very small percentage of the cost of goods sold. You recognize the trouble we can have here. It's a major portion of our bill of materials, but you know what? A 10-cent screw stops you from shipping out a printed circuit assembly or complex electronic assembly. You know, you can't just send it out and missing a part. So you still need it. The final quadrant is what we call a strategic. These are need to have those long-term strategic partnerships and alliances with suppliers. These items have limited supply in the marketplace and also represent a high percentage of the cost of goods sold. I want you to think for a minute. If you're a purchasing agent, which quadrant would you want to be responsible for? Where would you want most of the items under your control to be? Now, it's interesting. I taught a supply chain class where somebody said non-critical. I said, wow, that's a real lazy person. Maybe I need to reword the question. Yeah, I guess that's interesting. But Michael Ford says, I want to be responsible for leverage items. That's where the advantage is really to me, because I'm leveraging suppliers against each other. In terms of the supply and demand, the economic forces, I'm in a good position here. I can make a lot of money for my firm when I do a good job of looking for the vendor who's going to give me the lowest price. Again, I got to keep ensuring I have that caveat, assuming they're giving me the quality and customer service desired. Then I can help make lots of profit. Where would the last spot I want to be? Bottleneck. That's the tough one. You're going to be busting your butt to try and find sources of supply for the bottleneck items, and it really doesn't help your company's bottom line at all because it's cheap items. I'm going to suggest, if we could fill in this sheet, try to think of examples for your business. And if you can't necessarily complete this exercise now, at least after the webinar or with teammates at your place of employment. I think in my experience, the non-critical items were what we used to call floor stock items. We stocked them on the factory floor. So it was like the MRO items, and then things like routine hardware or, fasteners, things that, were cheap, easily available, lots of suppliers. It's not really that important. The leverage type of items for the company I worked at, and I should clarify, I worked at electronic manufacturing. So a leverage type of item could be perhaps cable harness assemblies or sheet metal. These were major portions of the cost of goods sold, but we had lots of vendors available locally who could provide those.
And Amy, you had all of the beauty tools, and so Melanie.
Miss, mute, please. Thank you. In the upper left, the bottleneck, it was actually specialty hardware. So there was some hardware my company purchased that had to have powder coating on it, and it was really tough to acquire. Not every hardware vendor could provide that. So it was still cheap hardware, but it had specialty coating on it, so it was hard. There were only a couple of suppliers. And in the upper right, it was printed circuit board assemblies, complex printed circuit board assemblies. There were some printed circuit board assemblies we had that cost thousands of dollars. It's not a single circuit board. It's what we used to call the brains of our assemblies. It was multiple boards, wiring, harnesses, etc. As you look at this matrix with the 4 quadrants, I'd like you to take a pen or a pencil and draw a couple of diagonals. So please draw a diagonal from the upper left corner where it says supply chain risk is high. Please draw a diagonal through the intersection of the crosshairs down to where it says percent of COGS high. So you're really drawing a line from where it says high on each axis. So we could say from the upper left, the northwest corner, down to the lower right, the southeast. I'd like you to then draw another diagonal going from the origin through the crosshairs up through the strategic single source. So from the lower left, we could say that is southwest, up through the right to the northeast. And the question is, each of these diagonals should be labeled with one of the following terms: single source, or multiple source. In other words, non-critical and strategic, that should either, both of those quadrants should be preferably a single source or multiple sources. And then the bottleneck and leverage, those are either both a single source or multiple source. Just pause for a second to let you think about that and write down your answer. And it is the non-critical and strategic seek to have single source. Although I know purely single source is tough in some environments. We know we're boxing ourselves in. So let me say, if you think maybe, well, it's only 2 or 3, at least a small number of sources. It is the bottleneck and leverage where we should have a wide range of choices. And let me clarify that. The non-critical, I actually prefer that to be VMI, vendor managed inventory. It's not that important. There's lots of sources of supply. It's not a high portion of my COGS. Vendor managed inventory, let somebody else handle that. It's not worth my purchasing agents wasting time on it. The strategic is single source because that's the opportunity for the long-term alliance or strategic relationship. The leverage is multiple source because, again, we're trying to leverage suppliers to get our business. And they're competing for us. The bottleneck is multiple sourcing because, holy moly, I don't want to run out of something that's just a couple of pennies or a very small percentage of COGS. So we want to have backup sources of supply with the bottleneck. Moving to the weighted factor analysis. So this is the next page of the handout. Some of you may recognize this as the alternative attribute ranking. It is also known as the qualitative factor analysis because it converts a qualitative judgment into quantitative numbers. It's going to assign weights based on an individual factor or criteria's importance. Then we assign scores based on each alternative or our choices. So in this example, I put the factors across, labeled each column in descending order of importance: lead time, quality, schedule flexibility, etc. I gave them a weight as a percentage. When we do the math, we know to convert the percentage to a decimal, so 25% becomes 0.25. The sum of the weights needs to be 100%, or in terms of decimals, 1.00. Note this is just something I used as an example. For your organization, you will decide what factors are important. I, of course, intentionally left off price because I think that's the least valuable thing we should look at. But that's my opinion. You decide what factors. So you might use what's on this list. You might use others. You certainly would come up with different weights than my imaginary scenario here. So you decide what the factors are, what's important, and assign the weights. I just randomly said, okay, we've got supplier A, B, and C. And I assign scores based on a scale to 10. I've seen other examples of the weighted factor analysis. They go to a scale of 100. Either one works as long as you're consistent, for all the suppliers you use, you're ranking them on the same scale. What's different is if your ratings or scores are on a scale to 10, the highest possible score is 10. If you're rating on a scale of 1 to 100, then the highest possible score is 100, which means somebody like supplier B scores 100 on everything. And then when you multiply by the weights, it still equals a total of 100. I have performed the calculation for supplier A, 10 times 0.25 plus 8 times 0.23 plus 4 times 0.18, etc., gives us a score of 6.98. I'd like you to break out the calculators or smartphones and do the calculations for B and C and determine which is the preferred supplier, i.e. the one with the highest score. I'll give you a minute or two for that. And as you're doing the calculation, I'll share a couple of tips. We recognize there can be a bias because that's subject to individual discretion. I might think lead time is the most important. You might think it's quality. I might think schedule flexibility is an 18% weight. You might think it's 33. Then when it comes to the scores, I think supplier B is a 10 on schedule flexibility. Maybe you think it's an 8. So there could be bias here. The way to overcome this is to perhaps have a purchasing team or a sourcing team reach consensus on the factors, the weight of each factor, and then the scores of the suppliers. I'll move ahead to share the results of the scores. And again, you don't have to write these down. John's going to email you the answer key. It comes out that supplier A has a score of 6.98, supplier B has 6.39, and supplier C has 5.74. So supplier A would be the winner on this criteria. Now, again, it's important to note we could have bias. I've suggested some ways of overcoming the bias. Those techniques will be included in the answer key. And one more tip that I got from Colin Seftel, who I met in South Africa when I was attending the CPSM conference, that's South Africa APICS. He recommended that you set a minimum score within each factor. So in other words, you say the suppliers have to get at least a 5 out of 10 or a 6 out of 10 on everything. The important reason for that is maybe some supplier scores a 10 on a couple of the most important criteria, and they end up winning, even though they have a 2 or a 3 on other issues. And I thought that's pretty good. Set a minimum score for each one. So that might be a suggestion. Another suggestion with this, maybe we have a list of a dozen or a couple dozen potential suppliers, and we use the weighted factor analysis to narrow down the list to maybe 3 or 4 or 5 suppliers, and then use on-site visits and personal interviews and other techniques to decide which one is the preferred supplier. My final piece of advice with this, perform the weighted factor analysis for each of the 4 quadrants. So do the weighted factor analysis for the non-critical items, the bottleneck items, the leverage, and the strategic, because different things will have different areas of importance. So for example, leverage, it might be pricing is the most important because you're trying to leverage suppliers against each other. With strategic, it might be quality and customer service. So you decide, do this analysis for 4 different categories of suppliers based on the 4 different types of buys. And my expectation is the factors you select would look different. The weights that you assign would look different. The next item is core competencies. What's a core competency? It's what we compete on. It's how we set ourselves apart from the pack. There are terms we may be familiar with, either through the APICS certification curriculum or perhaps in any operations management text or a conference session or journal article. Perhaps you've heard these terms. And I'm going to define these, and I'm going to start with the order qualifiers. I think that's where we should start. An order qualifier is a feature, an option, or a competitive characteristic that you have to compete in the game. It gets you in the game. It's the type of thing you have to qualify, perhaps for submitting bids. It's the minimum things that you need in place. An order winner is what lands you the sale. That's the competitive characteristic that is the deciding factor. It's what gets the customer to sign on the line that is dotted. Non-issues means relatively unimportant. It's not that important. And I'm going to define order loser different from the official APICS dictionary. I feel empowered to disagree at times. According to the official APICS dictionary definition, an order loser is something that if you don't have, you lose the sale. And I thought, well, that's really defining it the same as an order winner. To me, an order loser is the opposite of an order winner. The APICS dictionary says an order winner, you got to have to win the order. An order loser, if you don't have it, you lose the order. I'm saying that would be the same thing. So clarifying, this is Mike Ford's personal definition. An order loser is something you get better at. You lose a customer order. Let me share a couple examples of these. For a fast food restaurant, an order qualifier, well, you got to have fast food. I drive up to the drive-through, 90 seconds or less. You got to have fast food to be a fast food restaurant. An order winner, I would say an order winner could be, well, the closest one to where you work. You say maybe you've only got a half hour for lunch and you got to stop at the bank or something. Well, hey, I'm going to whatever fast food restaurant is closest. Non-issue, maybe the ambiance and the seats or something. I don't think anybody picks a fast food restaurant because they think it's such a great environment. In fact, I remember reading an article ago that said fast food restaurant seating in Midtown Manhattan was intentionally designed uncomfortable because they want to increase throughput. They don't want people hanging around, lounging around after they eat their lunch. What's an order loser in the fast food restaurant business? Making your food taste better. That would actually cause them to lose business. Because if I get a Big Mac in Binghamton, New York, and you get one in Danbury, Connecticut, we expect it to taste the same. And if I buy a Big Mac in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Sacramento, California, we expect it to taste the same. And this, in fact, happened in the 1980s. Coke decided to make their cola drink taste better. And for those of us who remember that episode, you know how well New Coke went over. They should not have changed the recipe of something that for 90 years was the top selling cola on the planet Earth. So order qualifier, you got to get in the game. Order winner wins the sale. Non-issues, relatively unimportant. Loser, you get better at it, you actually lose market share. These are a really challenge with the companies I've consulted with or companies where I've done on-site training. Seems like a lot of companies have trouble with the concept of non-issues. They say, Ford, you don't understand. We got to have the greatest product variety, the lowest price, the best quality, the best customer service, the shortest lead time. And I'm like, you cannot be all things to all people. When you try to be everything to everybody, you end up being nothing. You got to understand how you compete. And so I'm going to suggest, so I've got a page of the handout that has 9 different things you could potentially compete on. And you could add others, to complete the list. I'm going to suggest make copies of that and have your team at work or have multiple departments fill that out. People fill it out individually. I bet cash your company has trouble agreeing on that. You're going to have some people say price is the number 1 we compete on. Other people are going to rank it as number 9. That's bad if you can't agree what you compete on. I'm going to suggest if you can't reach consensus at your company, mail or fax this to your A customers. I bet they've got consistency. The companies that are purchasing from you, they know why they're buying from you. It's a sad thing if you got to ask customers why you're buying from us, but I suggest you do it. Just make it like a type of customer service survey or something like that. Understand how you compete. Focus all your resources on ensuring you have the qualifiers. After you've got the qualifiers in place, then spend every extra penny, every ounce of sweat, every second of time getting better and better on order winners. Don't waste time on non-issues. You won't gain market share. As you improve on an order winner, beat the competition. If you don't increase market share after improving on an order winner, then you didn't correctly identify an order winner. For example, if you think it's lead time, you devote resources, you shrink your lead time from 6 weeks to 3 weeks, you don't gain any market share, then that must not be your order winner. Something went wrong. I want to make sure that we extend this through the supply chain. So if you've decided we got to have short lead time, then buy from suppliers who have short lead time. If customer service is your market niche, then buy from suppliers who have great customer service. You've got to be consistent. We do not live in a world where it is competition between company A and company B. It is company A's supply chain versus company B's supply chain. How did Walmart kick the crap out of Kmart? Because they had a superior supply chain. How is now Amazon beating Walmart? Because they have a superior supply chain. I remember a company I worked for where we were doing complex electronics assembly, and our tolerances were to the 10,000ths of an inch in placing components on printed circuit boards and electrical assemblies. So customer service, quality, technical competency, we were make to order and engineer to order. But management turned around and told us, buy from the low bid supplier. So we're trying to compete in a marketplace saying we're unique, make to order, engineer to order, high tech, complex electronic assemblies. But management puts a gun to my head and says, buy from the cheapest supplier. You should not be surprised to know that company went out of business. We didn't have consistency on what we were trying to compete on in our selection of suppliers. The final major topic is vertical and horizontal integration. And when I explain these terms, I want to make sure to clarify it's going to be different from the way we picture things, say on a piece of paper or read in a book or a web page or an article. Vertical suggests upstream or downstream integration. Upstream meaning a business takes on something that formerly a supplier did. Or downstream, if we're manufacturing, that means we're getting into distribution or perhaps the retail marketplace. And I think the best example is the Ford Motor Company, no relation, the Ford Motor Company from over 100 years ago. Henry Ford's company used to own rubber tree farms, all right? And they harvested the rubber and they made the tires. They also owned iron ore mines. So they mined the iron ore. They owned furnaces that then sandblasted that into pig iron. They owned steel foundries that then forged the pig iron into steel. And they ultimately had control of all the business to selling the cars. So we say that's from soup to nuts, or a friend suggested I change this from soup to lug nuts. It was the completely vertically integrated supply chain from planet Earth to planet Earth. I always say the planet Earth is the start of every supply chain. It's also the end of every supply chain when it comes to the end of use end of life cycle or disposal. It's important to remember that when we think about sustainability, when you remember the planet Earth is the start and end of every supply chain. So the Ford Motor Company had that. Let's contrast that with horizontal integration. With horizontal integration, that suggests we're expanding our business, but at a particular supply chain node. So General Motors became a conglomerate that was a merger of all these different individual companies. Chevy, Buick, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, and Cadillac used to be their own companies. So that was the automotive manufacturing supply chain node expanding at one node. What could be the advantages versus limitations of the vertical and or horizontal? Well, with vertical, you say that's complete control. This should help me schedule. I've got complete supply chain visibility because I own the entire supply chain. I've got to know where everything is. I can coordinate all of the schedules. What's the limitation? Well, can your company really be great at rubber tree farming and iron ore mining and the manufacture of pig iron, steel foundries, all of the sub-assemblies, final assemblies, distribution and sales of automobiles? That kind of stretches what your core competency is. So the trend over the course of our lifetimes has been for companies to focus on the horizontal integration. What am I good at? Get better at it. And I should note, horizontal is going to be consistent with outsourcing, right? I'm going to do what I do best, and I'm going to outsource things that are not my core competency, things that I do not excel at. Could we perhaps think of examples? So we look at this page, you've got a crosshairs example again. At the top, you've got vertical and upstream integration, acquiring a source of supply. Can you think of an example for the company you work for? Or if not, maybe an example, that you've read in the news or know about? I like the example of McDonald's getting into potato farming. McDonald's Corporation is the world's most prolific potato farmer. Why did McDonald's do that? Because of French fries. It's such an important item to them, they decided to get into potato farming. McDonald's as well does own some cattle farms in some countries as well. How about the opposite end? Vertical, but downstream. So at the bottom of the page, expanding into distribution or retail channels. Has your company done anything to expand downstream in the supply chain? I think a convenient example here is Apple stores. Apple makes computers and decided to use Apple stores, the retail marketplace, to sell their product. Let's look at the X or horizontal line that we have here in terms of the crosshairs. Over on the right-hand side, merging with a competitor. Has your company ever done that? As an example, I think of Hewlett-Packard and Compaq. Similar businesses merging with each other. Over to the left, acquiring a competitor. That's also horizontal integration. How about Fiat buying the Chrysler Corporation? So it's important to remember the benefits of vertical integration, control and coordination, the limitation of lack of focus. With horizontal integration, we get to exploit our core competency. We can take care of economies of scale and efficiencies. The limitation is it's just limitation at one specific supply chain node. So we don't have the coordination that we would have with vertical. And again, Horizontal integration consistent with outsourcing. In summary, we describe a purchasing continuum that suggests to the far left, it's tactical. It's just based on the transaction. It might be a one-time spot buy and we never do business with that vendor again. As we move across towards the right, we go to blanket purchase orders, ultimately to a year-long or multi-year contracts, and then the most extreme position, a pure strategic alliance, a merger or acquisition. We described 4 major types of buys. We said there's the non-critical, not really that important. Very low supply chain risk, lots of suppliers available, and it's not important in terms of its portion of the percentage of goods sold. We had the leverage items. That's what I want to be responsible for. I can leverage suppliers against each other because there's lots of choices on supply and it's a portion of my cost of goods sold. So anytime I squeeze some money out of the suppliers to get a lower price, I'm getting a lot of money back in terms of profit. The bottleneck. Heaven forbid, I don't want to be the buyer responsible for bottleneck unless you really love a challenge and like living life on the edge. That's limited supply, yet it's only a small proportion of our COGS. The strategic. That's where we're looking for those really long-term partnerships. It's the items that are both limited supply and a major percentage of our COGS. Reminder, strategic and non-critical are preferably a single source or very limited sources of supply. It's leverage and bottleneck. We want lots of sources of supply. Next, we did the weighted factor analysis, a supplier selection tool. For your company, you're going to decide what factors are important, the weights that you assign to them, your list of suppliers and the scores they get. And as I said, this most commonly may be used to reduce a large list of potential suppliers down to a smaller list that you can then use on-site visits or personal interviews to decide who you ultimately do business with. We stress the importance of core competencies. What do I compete on? What is important for my marketplace? I need to understand, is it short lead time, product variety, quality, customer service, price? We can't compete on everything. We think we do. There's a lack of focus. We don't understand our environment. The final major topic, we describe vertical and horizontal integration of the supply chain. Vertical can be upstream when we get into the supply side of the business or acquire a source of supply. Downstream and vertical is when we move from manufacturing, say, into distribution, or we're into distribution and we get into retail. Horizontal is we expand at a particular supply chain node, perhaps merge with another company, acquire another company, keep expanding our market share and growing larger. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can contact me with follow-up questions at michaeldford@earthlink.net. My phone number, this is a mobile number you can call or text. This is a US number, so it's 607-624-4853. Wow, I should have edited this out, so I guess this is when I do it in person. So I regret to say I cannot give you business cards online.